gets warmed with my body heat, yeah. I love Panty Pony Dash so much. Oh my god, I love that. Oh, it's so good. The first, like, 3 or 4 episodes are honestly, I was like, I didn't care about it. But overall, it's such a good show. Oh, man. Whew. Hopefully everybody's doing well. We're having a nice time, enjoying ourselves with some good, wholesome family content, right? Wholesome. Wholesome. Yes. Yes. I'm excited for this one. I'm hoping this is more of a real documentary style deep dive and not just some kind of meme video. But it would be cool to hear him bring up like Angel Blade and La Blue Girl a couple times. It would be cool. Not that I've ever seen those or know what those are. I've never known what a studio foe is my entire life. That's awful for you to assume such a thing. But no, I'm sorry. This video is an incomplete history of hentai by ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕥𝕒𝕚. Hopefully that's how you pronounce that. I will have all of these videos in the description of my VODs. Of my highlights, excuse me. I'm excited for this one. This one's a bit longer, and I might not yap as much, so let's sit back and just enjoy. Wah.
Listen, we both know you clicked on this video. Don't hide it. You saw the thumbnail or the title and thought it was interesting. You wanted to see what it's about. And some of you might think it's a joke. Some of you, I'm sure, saw this after someone posted the thumbnail with a witty caption about how they aren't gonna watch it. I get it. I understand. But I just want to say right now, this is serious. And if you give me just a few minutes of your time, I'll explain why. This topic, which I'll avoid saying the name of for a few more seconds so I don't get demonetized, is incredibly popular.
I remember this.
Anime and manga and Japanese media in general that millions of...
You have to wait like 30 seconds into the video or something like that, or it'll flag certain words. Also, it's a popular subgenre of these things from the land to the east. Whatever could it be? I've never partaked in such a thing.
People around the world watch and read. It's one of the most popular forms of adult entertainment. So much so that in a previous video about adult animation, most of you thought I was talking about it. And through the internet and word of mouth, most likely everyone watching this has at least heard the term before. Yet despite all that, we know nothing about hentai. For some context, if you're at all familiar with my channel, you'll know that I love to cover topics related to anime and animation, especially the parts that are considered somewhat taboo, because it's incredibly fun to research and talk about, considering how interesting and massively influential it all is.
Yeah.
So it only seemed natural to me to make something about hentai, this huge industry with so much history behind it and presumably so many interesting stories to tell.
He's very right that there is a lot of history behind it. People don't really know how far back this sort of media goes. Like, there was this sort of thing all the way back in the 80s too, right? Probably farther back, but these studios have been around forever. A lot of these talents have also been around forever that have animated this stuff. Anime used to have a lot more open nudity way back when. Like, even if you watch like the original like Urusei Yatsura, there's actual like booba flash in that show. It was a bit more common, and then it like kind of went away for a little while to my memory, and then it came back during let's see, my recent memory when it started coming back more is, does anybody remember the show, I think it's Ladies versus Butlers? That's one that I remember a bunch of people online being like, oh my god, this thing's uncensored. And then there was a small era of that like 2010s era in which a bunch of ecchi anime came out as a little more mainstream, a little more like prime time, that was like a way more uncensored. I know it's not necessarily hentai, but I'm just trying to say that this thing's been around for way longer than a lot of people know.
But I put it off. I purposefully avoided making a video like this. For the same reason, I think it's
all the way back to like the farmer's wife painting.
Because if you're at all familiar
or the
with my
fisherman's
channel,
wife, excuse
you'll
me.
know that adult topics like these are severely under-researched. If I made a video about James Cameron's new film, or Studio Ghibli's new anime, or how popular Shadow of the Colossus on the PS2 was, we can have a conversation about that because you already know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, it's just a Google search away. Hentai though? Despite being the #1 search term on every porn site for the last half a decade, and one of the most well-known words to come out of Japan period, just behind anime itself, I doubt most people could even name a studio. Most people don't even know what the word means in Japanese. So if you want
I've never heard of Leaf Studio.
Creators or animation directors or how the industry works, forget it. There are thousands of people busting their ass to make hundreds of animated works that are viewed by millions in an industry pretty much everyone is aware of, and we hardly know anything about them. Now, I'm already someone who strongly believes
What's an Alice Soft? I've never heard of them.
Adult topics, because there are so many interesting stories we can learn and connections we can make. But if we ever hope to do that, we need to at least learn the most basic information available. We need to get to a level of understanding that most other industries operate at by default. And that's what I want this video to do. Consider it an introductory lesson on the history of hentai. But first, I do need to mention a couple things. Number one, this is actually the first of 2 videos. Originally, it was going to be one big thing, but it got so large that I had to split it up, which I think still works well because this history I'm talking about has 2 distinct parts with different stories I want to tell. So if that second video is out, you'll be able to watch it here. If not, I'm working on it. Number 2, making videos like this is even more difficult than usual because there's a good chance they get demonetized. So this video will be heavily censored for YouTube.
I would expect nothing less from that. YouTube's been going crazy lately with how people have been getting hit with shit. I've had my channel get stricken with a vague thing. It didn't really tell me even what it was. It was just said like, oh yeah, your content was found to not be like part of our community guidelines, and so we're taking a bunch of features away from you. It's like, oh, that was cool. Didn't tell me what I was getting stricken for, but that was cool. I've mentioned before in another video, I believe, where one of the videos I had worked on that was an audio roleplay ASMR style thing was stricken down just for having a kiss in the audio, and one that wasn't sexual in any way. It was just a loving like peck. Yeah, this guy's brave for putting that shit out there to the system that hates us.
If you want the fully uncut version, go check that out on my Patreon for only $1. I'll leave a link to it in the description, as well as a message saying
it's actually not too bad.
Still has ads or not. And number 3, do you want to get in the Yeah, that's right. Have you ever thought about some until you maybe in your until you Well, lucky for you, you can. With the help of today's sponsor, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve is the nation's largest seller of adult toys, with over 20 million customers.
I didn't know you could
worldwide.
advertise that stuff on YouTube.
50 years, selling everything from
I've heard of Adam and Eve before.
And don't forget my favorite, I personally love using Adam and Eve products to So if you
I bet you do, buddy.
Adam and Eve has you covered. With discreet shipping, 24/7 customer service, and a 90-day hassle-free return policy, you don't have to feel...
Where else am I going to get my funny shibari ropes and the special oils I need to make sure they're nice and
fighting the
smooth?
spread of HIV around the world. Go check them out at adamandeve.com and use code LEX50 at checkout to get 50% off one item, free shipping to the US and Canada, and free rush processing. That's code LEX50 at checkout to get 50% off one item, free shipping to the US and Canada, and free
honestly
rush
kind of
processing.
cool that he got sponsored by that. Good on you.
I've been using hentai as the general term for all animated and drawn erotica coming from Japan. That's the common usage for pretty much every
it's like a blanketed term.
country, but really that's just a Western invention. The word in Japanese actually doesn't mean this.
I think it means like perverted or something like that, right?
It's really just the Japanese word for pervert.
Yeah.
Or to get really into it, the word originated in China as this. You see, this kanji means to change, and this kanji means state. So combined, they just mean to change states or transform. However,
perversion,
kanji for change could
maybe
also be used as a noun to mean like something troublesome. So when it was adopted into Japanese, it gained this additional definition of
goddamn language is so complicated.
But then when combined back with
there's so many little things in these freaking languages. that just like, okay, this one thing means this, but it's actually this, but it's a combination of this. Oh my god, I want to learn the language. And to an extent, I can understand it when spoken, like a lot of anime. I don't really need to look at the subtitles that much anymore. I can understand a good portion of it. But it's like reading it is so awful. It's so miserable because it's not just like their language, it's a combination of like Chinese characters as well. God damn it. Oh, please. Somebody knows of a good resource to help me figure these languages out so I understand them, so I can stop having to deal with the worst translators I've ever seen in my life and read things in their purest form. Let me know.
The other kanji to become changing states, it sounded like you were saying an unusual state. So, over time, the whole word just became synonymous with abnormality. Come the late 19th, early 20th century, this term then became popular in academia, with journals like Hentai Shinri or abnormal psychology. The modern definition, linking it to sex, is believed to actually come from a German book, ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 Sexualis, from Richard von Krafft-Ebing. This being the book that coined the terms sadism and masochism, so it's pretty famous.
That's awesome.
And the title was translated.
What book is this? ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 Sexualis. Oh my god, I'm gonna read that. That sounds awesome. What? Somebody write that down for me in my Discord, please, so I remember. Future Onii-chan, mark this spot so you remember to check this out.
Translated as Hentai Seiyoku Shinrigaku, the psychology of abnormal sexual desires, with hentai's definition of abnormal now being something closer to perverse. Especially when ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 Sexualis was used as the basis for popular Japanese works, like Vita Sexualis by Morio Gai, a piece of erotic fiction depicting the life of the author in a military academy where all the older, more masculine boys had relationships with the younger ones. Fun fact, this book was actually considered somewhat famous for its commentary on Japanese masculinity at the time, and not so fun fact, it got the magazine it was published in banned from sale by the government. But you see, the 19th century
That's unfortunate.
era was the time where Japan opened itself up to the world after a long isolation. Literally called the Meiji Restoration after they restored imperial rule from the previous Tokugawa shogunate, who had barred any official contact with outside cultures. This was where the country began importing science and psychology among everything else from all over. It was this huge explosion of new research and fields of study. So naturally, the study of hentai seiyoku, or perverse sexual desires, was one of the things to gain momentum, as books from sexologists, like Kraft,
we've always been into it,
all really called sexologists, were imported en masse. This reached a peak in the Showa era of the 1920s, with the Eroguro Nansensu movement, where several full publications opened up within Japan.
Sorry, I'm just so invested into this. I apologize for not speaking a bunch.
Sexual topics, literally erotic, grotesque nonsense. And while
that sounds awesome, what?
Part, artists and fiction writers would start to become the face of the movement.
Huh. It's an interesting style. Yeah, I mean, for as long as we've been around, like, sex and sexuality have always been a thing for us. It's just a part of our human nature and like what we do. It's like, it's something we crave and desire. So of course we're gonna express it through art at some point, but this is like, it's interesting. I'm not a fan of the visual styles they have going on with the faces, but it is kind of cool to see.
Depicting sex and violence, and often the combination of the two, in ways that would push the boundaries of public perceptions of these matters. I mean, just to give you a specific idea, the tail end of the movement in 1936 was marked by the real-life Sada Abe, a geisha who murdered her lover and carried his severed penis in her kimono with her. So just imagine a genre of artwork and writing that's similar to that.
She is like Japanese Bobbit.
Popularity from this, and the one who's credited with popularizing Eroguro back was actually mystery author Edogawa Rampo, who had started writing straightforward detective fiction years prior, but at one point focused on Eroguro stories, like Inju, Beast in the Shadows, and Moju, the Blind Beast.
I'm gonna read those two. That looks awesome. That looks really cool. I want to read one of these. Beast in the Shadows, The Blind Beast. Hell yeah. Somebody also write those down for me, please. Thank you.
which depicted characters falling into obsession, transforming their minds and bodies, and committing crimes of a much more graphic nature.
Oh,
These
VTuber
books
fans.
would become some of Rampo's most successful at the time and would help to propel them to become one of Japan's premier novelists. So famous that Detective Conan's last name is a reference to them, which is pretty funny considering ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 Rampo is just a Japanese transliteration of Edgar Allan Poe. And to get back around to the reason I bring this up, those ℍ𝕖𝕟 science journals I mentioned did grow in popularity.
I love Conan.
With Japan's literacy rate being higher than ever, more people were able to enjoy reading scholarly papers, which meant the journals could cater to this broad audience with more accessible topics. And like the fiction they were published alongside, they would push the envelope, studying and dissecting specific fetishes and grotesque cultural topics that were considered unique to Japan, like seppuku, or the less talked about shinju, the concept of lovers committing suicide together, which as a psychological topic that was considered
just boys'
sexual
abyss
and deviant was labeled hentai. You can very easily see how the ℍ𝕖𝕟 movement would popularize hentai as a term and concept, and founded somewhat of a connection between it and the fictionalized art and writing that was becoming popular. Because remember, hentai just means perverse, something that most ℍ𝕖𝕟 creators and readers of this time would essentially self-identify as. As sociologist Mark McClelland partially quotes from Cartographies of Desire, despite the fact that hentai, perverse, was often invoked as the opposite of jotai, normal, it was perversion, not normality, that was obsessively enumerated in popular sexology texts, thus giving the impression not only that perversion was ubiquitous, but that the connotations of the term were not entirely negative. So, something I find interesting that I want to bring up is that this self-identification as hentai was not just pushed because of sex and shock value for the sake of it, nor was it contained to any specific morbid curiosity or self-pleasure. This is a movement that has been strongly theorized to have been born out of Japan's frustrations with this massive, frantic modernization they were going through at the turn of the century, and as such, has a surprising connection with politics.
I could see it's like you said, it's not an entirely like negative meaning behind the word. If it's just something you would say it's not of the norm, doesn't necessarily mean it has to be bad. There's a lot of things that are not necessarily normal, but we don't have to hold them as bad. They're just different and weird. Maybe one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, you're into that thing, I'm just gonna ignore it and you can have your thing over there. It's not really hurting anybody. But yeah, that's cool. I actually didn't know that part. I always assumed it meant like hard perversion, or it was the extreme form of the spectrum of like, okay, you're into some shit here. Like I would say, I would call pornography as a whole more of its extreme, as an extreme, right? Because it's the actual act or the depictions of, sex and whatnot itself. Or I guess you don't have to say, like, if you want to take it in the sense that I'm talking about, we're on topic here, where pornography can also mean other things, but this is what I'm referring to it as at the moment.
You see, the censorship that ℍ𝕖𝕟 publications faced was quite brutal. The main way in which books of all kinds were banned in Japan in the 20s and 30s was via the Home Ministry's newspaper law of 1909, a revision of several older laws enacted by a conservative government against rising leftist movements that gave them the power to shut down publications and confiscate works that were deemed offensive, both to public morality or the government. Now, ℍ𝕖𝕟 was not strictly political. In fact, it can be argued that it started off completely detached from that. But the law and the police forces being wielded against them certainly was, which even if there wasn't an explicit connection before, certainly created one in the eyes of many. Because as we all know, stopping people from sharing ideas is the quickest way to get them to team up and share even more. In fact, from 1923 to 1936, the number of books published yearly in Japan increased from 10,000 to 30,000. They were literally publishing so much that one of the most popular ways to escape censorship was to sell books in underground buying clubs that would simply sell out before the Japanese authorities could confiscate.
That's so cool. Oh, they had their little underground rings where they would just sell like weird illegal contraband shit. I mean, more specifically books, but that's so cool. I mean, where he's very like right, where it's like, okay, you try to ban or block the concept of ideas or tastes or whatever, people are gonna find their ways around it, no matter what. Just like we were talking about in the other videos, where like people really want to see your not safe for work chat in your Discord, they're gonna find ways around your shit. But yeah, it's it's so neat. Now you just go to artist alleys and I can just buy hentai right there. You got to do it in shame with your head bowed a little bit, but I mean, we're no longer doing it underground, which they should be. Imagine the adult section is underground in a cave. You have to go into a cave for it. That'd be so cool. To do it in shame.
Political writings at this time were often mixed in with erotic grotesqueness. ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟𝕒 often used political exploitation as a theme, and both had a very obvious focus on criticizing and working against the censorship that they were all facing. One of the most popular magazines at the time, Gorotesaku, was actually edited by radical activist Umeharo Hokame, and it famously released a segment simply titled A Bibliography of Contemporary Banned Books, to catalog all of the material that got taken off.
That's cool.
But really, if you need any further proof of this connection, Takehiro Tachibana, a former Japanese government censor himself, wrote in his memoirs that the present day is a period of the three rhos: ero, goro, and poro. Erotic, grotesque, and proletarian. So again, this idea of hentai as abnormal or perverse sexual desires, and the people who identified with it would obviously do so for some of the more obvious reasons of self-pleasure or scientific study. But a large reason, perhaps the one that built ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟𝕟 into the movement we know it as today, was that advocating for abnormality and perversion was a very popular form of protest, when that was the exact sort of thing the government wanted to destroy.
I could see that being a thing. We have something like that here as well, but it's okay. It's like big government. Fuck you, telling me what I can or can't read, or express myself in, or do what I want with my in privacy or whatever. That's still around today. Which is, man, government's never gonna change, is it? It's always about they get to dictate what the people can and can't have. They're going to dictate what they deem as inappropriate. They're going to dictate what you can or can't eat, right? It's always been around. But that's interesting seeing that this comes from originally a place of like, and nah, fuck you. Nah. Go to hell. Go hell, politician man. God. This is a fantastic video so far. Good on him for actually taking this as a serious topic and not making it all jokey and memey.
Though all of this came to a rather abrupt halt with the events leading into World War II, most notably the failed coup d'etat on February 26, 1936, that caused the conservative military to gain even more control over the government, cracking down on censorship with laws that could now potentially give those who did not comply the death penalty. And so, many works were taken out of print for good, including a large chunk of the catalog of Edogawa Rampo himself. And well, then World War II happened. Let's get back onto the topic of sex though, because I should make it very clear that this cultural fascination with sex does not start with the Meiji. Actually, as far back as the Heian era, 1,000 years earlier, Japanese workers and nobles and everyone in between began reading and admiring hand scrolls. These big slips of paper with artwork or text painted on them.
I bet one of those would be fantastic to read. I bet it'd be a cool experience.
Paintings carried around as a good luck charm. These gained popularity into the Edo period as Japan's literacy rate grew, and a specific type of scroll that was around since the beginning was shunga. Coming from spring pictures, the word for spring being a euphemism for sex, shunga was an art form that featured, well, exactly that. Both depictions of sex as paintings or drawings, or very commonly informational pamphlets giving sex education. And with the invention of woodblock printing, which allowed artwork to be mass-produced, and the ukiyo-e art form that came with it, shunga found its way everywhere. At the height of its popularity, most homes able to afford and read woodblock prints would have some shunga lying around, if not on their person. Men and women of almost any social or financial class would read it at their leisure, with seemingly very little, if any, scrutiny for doing so. So much so that there seemed to be a custom of gifting a newlywed bride a shunga scroll before her wedding, possibly alluding to that sexual education aspect of it. Artists that became popular.
I guess that's... I mean, that's very old school where it's like, yeah, give it to the womans, but I mean, nobody really teaches us this stuff, you know? It's like you get thrown into the act and you just kind of figure it out. But maybe having depictions on it, especially people who are newlyweds who are going to be like experiencing things for the first time, that, hey, like, here's guide, put thing slot A, B, right? That's maybe not necessarily a bad thing. It is neat to hear though that people just kind of read it at their leisure. Same way I would pull my phone out now and read my funny ecchi mangas while I'm waiting in the doctor's office. But now people would be very upset with me if they saw the sins I was committing. No, that's really neat.
For ukiyo-e would also all make shunga, including Hokusai, who we all know as the artist behind the Great Wave off Kanagawa,
Yeah, even I know
but who
Hokusai.
also made Lesbian Awabi Divers, Horny Widow, and everyone's favorite, The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife.
Yeah, there it is. That's the fisherman's wife one thing I mentioned earlier. That's so cool. It's such a interesting depiction too. Oh man, even all the way back then we were doing tentacles, huh? It's a really cool image, by the way. I really enjoy the posing on it.
I'll let Roger Sterling from Mad Men explain.
What is this?
It's an octopus pleasuring a lady.
I don't know why. I just thought it was really funny that Mad Men decided to feature this painting. Like, multiple times, actually. It's like a recurring bit in the show.
Remarkable.
Fun fact, The Dream of the Fisherman's Wife was actually made in 1814, over a decade before the Great Wave. And from hand scroll's introduction into Japanese culture all the way until the 20th century, all kinds of sexual material like it was produced, with many of the features that we would later see in modern Japanese pornography. Tentacles, exaggerated breasts or genitals, infidelity, same-sex relationships, you name it. Now, you must be thinking that obviously these works
Had yaoi back then.
deviant or abnormal as those being produced with eroguro, otherwise they wouldn't have been so widely accepted. And you're partially correct about that. You see, sex in Japan as a whole was a widely okay topic to discuss and even joke about, mostly because it didn't have the religious baggage that a lot of other cultures added to it. Shunga and the depictions of sex within were seen as rather ordinary and natural, often depicting its subjects having a good time, encouraging each other, or joking around, or even outright laughing while doing the deed. Now, there was artwork depicting darker topics, though this mostly came about in the later years of the art form's popularity, and even then it wasn't super harshly scrutinized. However, this did not mean that it never saw any scrutiny. In fact, in 1722, the Tokugawa shogunate,
Always gonna be a
as part
party
of its
pooper.
attempted restructuring with the Kyoho reforms, tried to ban shunga outright. Or rather, they tried to ban essentially the publication of all books and art prints and would only greenlight certain specific kinds, if the author gave their full name and registered with the authorities. The books allowed then coincidentally did not include anything considered to corrupt public morality, or anything that was critical of the government, and shunga seemed to have been caught
Classic.
up in the ban for both reasons, as during this time, hand scrolls were often passed around that would parody or criticize the shogunate. So, come 1722, shunga is now illegal, which at this point you should know does very little to stop it from being produced. While we don't have concrete numbers, we do know that shunga continued to flourish almost completely uninterrupted in the decades following the ban, and the decades following the consecutive reforms and additional bans on top of that. It was still published and sold and made people a profit, now in underground markets that sort of strain the definition of underground considering how accessible.
Yeah, how would you even enforce that at the
Because
time?
while the more political material might get punished or confiscated, shunga without political themes seemed to face almost zero resistance from the authorities. Ironically enough, it is in the Meiji era of the 1870s to 1910s that we see any successful opposition to sexual material in Japan. With the government doing its best to show off on the world stage and appear more modern, they banned anything deemed obscene or backwards. Actually, the first
Blame the West, as we always do, for being lame. We had cool shit, and then we want to impress Big Bro over here, and now we're lame. We can't have cool things, can't have nice things. It's so weird that I would say, like, even though I'm not necessarily like this in private where I think it's like, oh, it should be a big open discussion all the time, right? It's still base human nature. And it's still one of those things, like I mentioned earlier, like we crave what we want it. We're like designed, like literally designed around it. And they had a culture that openly expressed it or openly indulged in that kind of thing, where it's like, oh, yes, this is just a thing that people do and it's cool to read. but then people have to be kind of like sticklers about it, where I remember seeing a thing about like the invention of toilet paper when it first came around, and how it was very difficult to actually sell because the concept of even like talking about going to the bathroom was so taboo. It was seen as such like a bad thing that people going out in public and trying to buy TP or whatever was so like looked down upon to at least like watch somebody do it. And it's interesting to see that a lot of these Western values take parts of human nature and who we are and what we like or what we do and go, no, you shouldn't express them, you shouldn't have any of this, you shouldn't enjoy this publicly, in a thing where, yeah, now I think we're a lot like that, right? There's of course a lot of things that are bad for our brains to take in too much of, and certainly I'm not going to go out in public and be like, hey, look at this food dojin, right? I'm not gonna smash it in anybody's face, and I certainly wouldn't like read it publicly, really, but it's interesting that we got to that point so early on, and all it took was a bit of influence of wanting to be like them to see, or at least show that they've been modernized. Oh, they lost a piece of themselves and to try and impress someone else. It's how it is, how it always is. Thank you, government.
Obscene, or waisetsu in the Japanese legal system, is said to pop up in the 1880 Penal Code, itself based on France's Napoleonic Code. But even before this, they were banning things from tattoos to religions, particularly anything only practiced in rural
Tattoos
areas.
are still
And in 1872,
looked down
they
upon,
enacted
right?
the Ishiki Kai Jore, a Tokyo prefectural ordinance that banned mixed bathhouses, public nudity, sex toys, and shunga. And whereas before these types of bans did very little to stop anything, and indeed this one probably wouldn't have done much on its own, it did come with a larger cultural shift, one that turned the consumption of shunga into a bit of a long-standing taboo, even outside of its legality. This was then made official with the 1907 Penal Code, in which Article 175 prosecutes any person who distributes, sells, or publicly displays an obscene writing, picture, or other materials. So ultimately,
I talked about that earlier in the other video, where it's like, okay, so Big Brother essentially is like, this thing is perverse, we're not allowed to have this, you shouldn't have that, I'm going to tell you you're not allowed to have it, and if you do, I'm going to punish you. And we're going to call these these specific terms bad. But who are the ones who are actually setting these terms and these boundaries? Who are the ones who actually get to decide what is perverse, what is bad in general? And oftentimes that's going to be your freaking government. And they're not often in your best interest. And I think it's like where they're talking about like a cultural shift, right? The shift was to appear more, I guess, civilized, quote unquote, or westernized to the rest of the world. And you took that shit away. It was, I don't believe when government says it's for your betterment. I feel like there's always an ulterior motive behind it. Always.
shunga is one of the defining forefathers of sexual artwork and material in Japan, something that was seen as an almost universally accepted art form that only later became retroactively taboo as the country moved into this rapid modernization. Which means not only is it an early example of hentai, as we understand it to mean sexy Japanese art, but also hentai,
I like that part.
which was considered sexually deviant. And its banning and public shunning, in combination with the wide array of material about sex coming in from other countries, is what would almost single-handedly set the stage for eroguro nonsensu in the 1920s. So let's wrap back around to the 20th century. After World War II, Japan was obviously in a much different place than they were before, including regarding adult materials and art in general, as the war had consumed pretty much everything, and US occupation brought with it a whole bunch of other problems. But despite that, it's in this post-war environment we see another explosion of new ideas and artwork, especially those focused on sex, due in part to the same reasons as before: an excess of people wanting to express taboo ideas, and a large underground market willing to share and consume them. As Yoshikuni Igarashi writes, after the collapse of the pre-1945 regulatory regime, the bodies that stood among the ruins of the cities were celebrated as signs of the new life in Japan. Most Japanese cities had been destroyed by American incendiary bombing, and there was little to block the view in these urban spaces. For many survivors of the war, their bodies were the only material objects they managed to rescue from the destruction of the air raids.
That's
It is
sad.
then of little surprise that on August 15th, 1945, ordinary citizens celebrated the end of the war as the liberation of their bodies. Black markets that appeared in the ruins of the cities became privileged sites for such celebrations, places where many contemporary Japanese writers discovered the raw, erotic energy of Japanese bodies.
I could see in a way where it's like, wow, we just survived being nuked the fuck out, napalmed, and everything is gone. Like, all of it's just gone, but I'm the survivor. I'm still here. I could see going into your own personal exploration and getting back into that thing after everything else is lost. Or it's like, the human is still here for that. It's, wow, that's also sad thinking about that too. Man, what a fucked era.
That's from a book called Bodies of Memory, by the way, which, fun fact, uses the word body or bodies over 500 times in less than 300 pages.
Cool.
Which is, I just thought that I would bring that up. Because of the general feeling of post-war freedom and the complete lack of resources most people had, a new form of published media arose in the 1940s, that being pulp magazines. Literally called kasutori magazines as a reference to the low-quality rice alcohol of the same name that was essentially just moonshine. As, quote, drinkers were supposed to collapse after only 3 glasses, just as these magazines tended to fold after the third issue.
I've had a
Backyard
backyard moonshine before and it kicked my ass.
More specifically with Nikusai Bungaku, or literally flesh literature, also known as body literature to bring everything full circle.
That's
These
cool.
carnally focused magazines had the same 2 purposes as before, trying to entertain readers with rather shocking and explicit material while teaching and learning more about these topics. Magazines like 1947's Catan Club and Yomikiri Romance would openly publish hentai
Oh, that's
material,
such a cool cover.
around fetishes and BDSM, including artwork and now explicit photography, but also full write-ups and readers' columns, and long discussions between
Look at the old BDSM gear. There's a dog. There's just a dog over there on that one side. It's a dog here too. I know this stuff's been around forever, but it's really, especially in this culture, it's fascinating to see depictions of it. Like these old like leather collars and chains, the whole submission thing like this. That's fascinating. I never really thought about this kind of depiction, at least being that far back in Japanese history. I knew obviously this kind of stuff existed, right? Like that's been around forever. But the veil is lifting. I'm being liberated.
medical professionals, writers, and those who would self-identify as abnormal, all talking about taboo subjects together and trying to further their understanding. This is a whole other topic someone should make a video about, but Catan Club magazine in particular is considered largely responsible for the popularity of rope bondage in Japanese culture, and most likely Western culture as well. The term shibari as we know it today, tying, actually stems from kimbaku, or tight binding, and has origins leading all the way to Edo, Japan. Since metal was so rare,
I used to
prisoners of all
practice
times
shibari
were bound
knots.
with rope in a martial art known as hojo jutsu, which had many different schools and variations on how you could tie someone up. These techniques then inevitably became used in sexual contexts, starting off in kabuki theater as a common way to
I love kabuki theater.
which then inspired some to start depicting fully naked women tied up in complex and decorative ways, becoming a particular fascination
That's a cool
of
image.
artists and photographers over the years. One such artist, Minomura Ko, under the pen name Kitoreko, was actually one of the editors of Catan Club and pushed the magazine to focus on bondage as much as it did, notably including a lot of shunga-style kimbaku artwork.
That art is so cool.
Very popular. But you see, while Kitoreko was drawing fetish material for adult magazines, that same year another up-and-coming artist would put out a comic for younger audiences. That comic being New Treasure Island, and the author being Osamu Tezuka. Now, I have an entire video on the influence of Tezuka here, and specifically how they shaped artwork in Japan in a more adult way, and how they themselves drew inspiration from Western animation. So thankfully, I don't have to repeat all of that. But their influence on art in general is perhaps more important here, As shunga was seen as taboo and was losing its favor in publications to the much more accessible photography, the hentai magazines published in the 40s and 50s featured mostly just photos. But with Tezuka came the popularization of manga, and thus the renewed interest in art-focused magazines and comic books. And more specifically, where shunga had a certain fantastical quality about it, over time a lot of material tried to pursue a form of realism, something pushed by the advent of photography and something sought out by those into Edogoro and Nikitai Bongaku. So with Tezuka came these cartoonish and cute characters who had a very different appeal than the realistic depictions that came before.
I really like that art
Because,
style.
as anyone familiar with Tezuka's work will point out, there was this readily apparent sexual component to a lot of what he made. You see, Tezuka and his immediate predecessor.
Yeah, I realize the subject matter of this is a little more adult, and I don't want it to be just kind of open, so I put the thing right now for my stream saying that this section is talking about sexual themes. So hopefully that's okay.
Manga hit it big in the mainstream, especially with younger audiences, so any sexuality they contained was very tame compared to what we've talked about before. Yet they did contain a lot of the same themes as we've previously discussed. Bondage and sadomasochism and gender confusion, just on a very subdued level. Tamaki Saito refers to this as a polymorphous perversity, describing how Tezuka would often include sexuality in an offhanded or casual way, blending it in with all the other elements to the point where it feels almost subconsciously included. Most likely because he was just including in his works what he wanted to draw, even these taboo sexual themes. But as
Me
I
learning to
discussed
draw
in
right
the
now.
video about Tezuka, a competing art form to manga itself popped up called Gekiga, which as a response to manga's success, honed back in on that realism and those darker themes, showing more upfront and shocking content in that same pulp magazine comic book
Those
form.
are so
And
cool
magazines
looking.
specifically focused around erotic gekiga, literally dubbed ero gekiga, began publishing at an alarming rate. By the
Ero.
1970s, it's estimated 80 to 100 different ero gekiga magazines were published per year, and were circulating over 5 million copies. If you were trying to find the first hentai, as we define the term in the West, Ero Gekiga is probably where you'd look. More specifically, magazines like Manga Erotopia, first published in 1973, or its two sister magazines, Manga Erogenica and Gekiga Alice. These were full comic book magazines focused explicitly on hardcore sex, drawn in the style that we now associate with Japanese manga, though at the time they were another thing entirely. But if you were trying to find the first hentai at all, I'd hope the video up to this point makes it clear just how pointless that would be. Anyway, where Tezuka's works might tease the idea of cross-dressing or BDSM or stir the imaginations of the people reading, Ero Gekiga just bluntly showed it to you in graphic detail, which kept it much more underground, but let it continue to push those boundaries, as
Awesome.
Tezuka was very tightly constrained by publishing guidelines and parent-teacher groups protesting his more suggestive works. Despite Gekiga being a largely, fuck Tezuka, this shit isn't for kids movement, it did have a very symbiotic relationship with the man. This way that manga would introduce some theme to the mainstream, which might entice people to pursue things like Gekiga to further satisfy them, which would then keep them reading comics as a whole. And this idea of introducing and educating about certain topics was something Tezuka himself picked up on, even creating the series Marvelous Melmo to be a form of sex education. And of course, Tezuka would eventually start publishing his own Gekiga comics to further connect things, as well as
I love the art
Anime
so
trilogy
much.
in the early 1970s, which were X-rated mainstream animated movies released in theaters. But at this point, we're really overlapping with my adult animation video, so just go watch that for more. The specific artistic shift and the sort of evolution sexual content went through here, I think can be best summarized by looking back at the term hentai. Because while its definition remained steady, and in fact remains steady to this day, another term started to branch off of it during this time. That being ecchi. The exact origins of the term are a bit contested, though the largely accepted story is that since post-war Japan had a lot more English influence, the word hentai began to be written out in Romaji, the Roman alphabet. And somewhere along the way, the first letter of the word, H, began to be used as a shorthand to refer to things that were sexual.
Yeah.
The first recording of the word being an article in 1952 mentioning a woman saying "Ora ecchi yo," or "Hey, that's lewd," to a groper in public. This isn't too dissimilar to the already existing words sukabe and iarashi, which can be translated as like lewd or dirty, though interestingly, ecchi branched off and over time took on this much less vulgar and negative definition, becoming a sort of cutesy way to say horny and being used in a wide variety of contexts. Whether it's calling a movie or a person or a certain piece of art ecchi, or even just saying echisuru to refer to the act of sex itself. So, just like
We should
Tezuka's
bring
manga
back
opened
it
up
being
this new
cute
avenue
and
of artwork
kawaii.
sexual content that was removed from the previous taboos and ideas of perversion, the term ecchi also gained steam as a term for sex separate to the negatively viewed hentai it stemmed from, which was still associated with deviancy. And while I can't directly link the evolution of the word to the evolution of comics, I think there's a strong case to be made that it isn't a coincidence they both happened at the same time. I can't help but see a parallel between ecchi and manga and hentai and gekiga as the two sides of the coin of sexual material. One representing something sexually suggestive yet widely accepted, the other representing sexual perversion and its taboo and underground nature. Now, I've skipped around a bit here, but where the 1940s to 60s were the rise of tezuka and manga and gekiga, the 70s and 80s is when that all finally transformed into what I would consider modern hentai.
Yay!
It is interesting that we attribute the 70s as the turning point here, because if we look again at the political scene of Japan at the time, wouldn't you know it, there were massive revolutionary movements fighting the government again. This time with the 1968 student protests, which started around corruption in the university system before gaining momentum and being organized into a
Corruption in
large
universities,
anti-government
huh?
leftist coalition that expressed discontent with American imperialism and the ANPO Treaty between the US and Japan. A coalition that was itself a renewal of the previous ANPO Treaty protests of 1960, where
look at the
both
turnout.
times students and activists banded together to try and prevent the US from retaining military bases on Japanese soil. And guess what? These protests became as big as they did for the exact same reason that erogekiga and hentai magazines flourished. The government, due to being weaker than ever and forced into reversing course on its pre-World War II trajectory, repealed most of the censorship laws around publications, which allowed material, both obscene and seditious, to find an audience. The availability of cheap pulp paper then served as a way for people to spread political messaging and theory, which further radicalized the population of very literate and educated university students. More than that, gekiga itself was often political.
Something that never
It's
changes,
a
huh?
spiritual descendant of eroguro, after all. Much of the material being published was written by those with strong, typically left-leaning political beliefs, and as such became popular with the student protesters and activists. So the lines between gekiga magazines and outright political commentary were very thin from the outset. These protests did fail, though, and received heavy government as well as public backlash. The Japanese Socialist Party actually lost 50 seats in the next election, and this led to results that should seem all too familiar at this point. Japan's government started to censor things more heavily, including that which was sexual or politically charged, and creatives at the time expressed their frustration with much more explicit works to compensate. Per Kyoto Nagayama, author of erotic comics in Japan, just as defeat in the Second World War gave birth to a post-war generation of cynics and nihilists, so too did the two-time defeat of the protest movement.
Yeah, I could see you coming off of that, like, not too long ago of, wow, our country has been slammed and bombed to shit, and now we've lost these big protests of ours. I can see how people would be like, who the fuck cares anymore? I feel like that still rings true for today, where it's like anything we really, really want, or it's like, please do this thing I'm asking you to do. Please, the bare minimum, make this okay, make this functioning, and stop being an ass about everything. And then you're like, nah, it's just going the other way. Here, I guess. Yeah, it's the same as usual. I'm gonna go read my hentais, I guess.
The 1970s were an era when the gekiga magazines that had appeared one after another from the middle of the previous decade became established and prosperous. Naturally, erotic expression also further advanced. To expand a bit on the censorship aspect though, you remember that penal code of 1907? Well, it turns out that's still around and is actually still active in Japan to this day, just radically changed over the years. One example of that change being Article 175, which made obscene material illegal. The article itself was never rewritten as far as I'm aware, however the definition of obscene in the penal code is, funnily enough, completely undefined, leaving that up to the Supreme Court to decide, which it very much did in March 13th of 1957, half a century later, when one ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟𝕟 was prosecuted for a translation of Lady Chatterley's Lover, an English erotic fiction book that has been at the center of major obscenity trials in the UK, Canada, Australia, the United States, and India, and very much lost its case in Japan, where, when asked to define obscene so that the book could be classified as such, the judge said that it, quote, refers to a writing, picture, and everything else which tends to stimulate and excite sexual desire or satisfy the same, and consequently, to be an obscene matter, it must be such that it causes man to engender feeling of shame and loathsomeness.
That last part. Oh, the afterwards shame and loathsomeness. You get your serotonin hit, and afterwards, like, oh, I'm so alone. That reminds me a lot of the current like YouTube rule against ASMR stuff, where it's the thing of like anything that could be considered sexually gratifying is bad in ASMR content, where it's just vague enough that they can just make it whatever they want to stimulate and excite sexual desire. That's so... It's so vague. That's such a massive topic. There's obviously the very base things you would expect it to be, right? But then there's the weird shit outside of that where a lot of things don't even have to involve nudity. It just has to be perverse in a way that you're like, ooh, haha, look at that. Look at that thing. You could argue like shibari, where shibari's tying someone up, but you can be sexually attracted or sexually like aroused by the person being tied up in a special way, and who gets to decide whether it is or isn't obscene. Where you can argue, no, it's just tying someone up, and the other person argues, hey, look at this, is very obviously meant to be dirty, and who gets to say exactly what it is other than those in power.
What the fuck does that mean? Something is obscene if it makes you feel shame? Is that not just anything you don't like? I'd say this is a gross misapplication of the law, but honestly, it's not even as bad as America's definition of obscene, where the judge simply said, I know it when I see it. But the vagueness of obscenity makes their sexual material and how it gets banned or censored.
I don't even have words for that.
Strange, because the most common interpretation of obscene, which has been upheld over the years since 1957, is that it mainly does not allow the showing of genitals, penetration, or pubic hair. Something originally documented in a court case in 1918, which stated the pubic area need not be hidden, but there should be no anatomical details to draw the viewer's attention. Which is why even hardcore pornography in Japan now pixelates these things, with such stupid loopholes as the fact that you are allowed to show a butthole uncensored on camera, because that isn't shameful somehow, but if you show someone having sex with said butthole, that has to be censored. Also, there are exceptions made on the basis of artistic merit, but pretty much anything that could be found remotely erotic supersedes this, meaning you are technically allowed to show genitals in a theatrical film, but only if nobody could get off to it. Which is all to say the first example listed on Japanese Wikipedia for an uncensored penis being shown in cinemas is Jackass 2. That is a real fact. I'm not even gonna try to fact check it and make sure it's accurate, because it's really funny. Anyway, what is this?
I hated the Jackass films.
With the cultural shift that happened after the failed protests of
They're
the
so
60s,
of their era.
The 70s were marked with a sort of re-examination of culture. One such example being a new wave of Japanese feminism, which stemmed from the female groups that sprung up due to the dissatisfaction they had in being told they weren't allowed to join the protests in 1968. A very real topic of discussion at the time that spread out over the following years. Needless to say, one of the effects of this was the proliferation of shoujo manga, or manga mainly targeted at young girls, and its rising popularity even among male readers. I've also talked about this topic before.
I read a good bit of shoujo.
But this idea of cuteness and sexuality mixed together that Tezuka brought sort of met its final evolution with the introduction of Bishoujo, or Beautiful Girls comics, which very much focused on the cute elements of the characters that they depicted, though often in much less innocent ways. Bishoujo could be much more explicit than Tezuka's manga, but much more whimsical than anything in ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟. And it wasn't even purely beautiful girls either, as we can see more female-oriented shoujo manga create subgenres like boys love comics and yaoi, these very explicit works which would also focus on cuteness as a subject and homosexuality sometimes as a fetish for straight female readers. The so-called bishoujo boom where these comics took over in terms of popularity began happening in the early 80s.
Okay, I'm gonna ask, because this has been in my brain for a very long time and it pertains to yaoi, okay? Does anybody remember the trope of the forbidden vase? Anyone at all? If anybody can tell me they remember the forbidden vase trope with yaoi stuff, please let me know. I need to know that I'm not the only one out there that remembers that. I don't know how far I could get into describing what it is. Where it's flowers being placed inside the guys, you know what, like a vase, the forbidden vase. Anyways, okay, moving on.
Though there are a couple more things that began to take shape just before that. One of them was the growing popularity of doujinshi, or self-published manga, something that came about during a sort of turning point in Japanese comic history, where ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟, one of the main ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 magazines published by Tezuka himself, shut down. ℍ𝕖𝕟, alongside its competitor Garo, was known for having rather socially savvy writers and a lack of distinct gender demographics, which opened up its readership to a wider variety of works. The magazine shutting down then became one of many reasons a lot of artists looked to self-publish their works and sell them individually, instead of going through the magazine publication process.
That's one thing I know now, where I feel like currently the word doujin or doujinshi is way more associated with the actual hentai part of anime, but growing up in the actual otaku world and going to all like the shitty little cons where I could buy fan subbed VHSs of stuff, like doujins, at least in my memory, always meant, like he said, it was self-published. It didn't have to pertain to any very specific genre. It didn't have to be ecchi or hentai or lewd or anything. It was just, I made this, here's my own publication of it, and you can buy it from me. Where I feel like now doujin or doujinshi is almost exclusively used for that sort of thing. I don't know what it's like in the East for how they use that word, if that's still used that the same way, but everyone I've ever spoken to or everyone I see now uses it in that kind of context.
Which led to the explosive growth of Comiket, a convention based around selling doujinshi, starting in 1975, and interestingly enough, having an initial attendance of 90% women. ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 shutting down was not the worst of what happened to ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 though, as Manga Erogenica, one of the major magazines that we talked about, was charged for its November 1978 issue under Article 175. And it wouldn't be the only case, as the government seemed to be cracking down on explicit magazines of all kinds, especially anything sold in convenience stores, bookstores, or vending machines. So you probably don't need to imagine what happened next. ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 and ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 creators who were being censored and shut down in magazines.
I'm sorry to pause again, but I also need to talk about this. So I feel like there was always the trope episodes of anime in the maybe 2000, like the mid 2000s to 2010s era, which, if it was a slice of life, you were almost expected to have the beach episode and the komike episode. And I don't see komike really brought up too much anymore in anime, even like in big slice of life ones that I know. I don't remember if Dress Up Darling, if they go to komike or not, or if they just go to general cons or like meetups. But yeah, that was such a big thing. You, like I said, you could always expect to have the komike episode. Oh, the kids The kids need Genshiken more than ever.
Turned to self-publication, forming the same sort of underground groups as ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕦 and ℍ𝕖𝕟 and everything prior, though with Comiket and everything surrounding it being the most popular market for doujinshi, and with all of that being dominated by shoujo and more female-driven subgenres, the hole left in the market by ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕦 started to be filled with bishoujo, and this turned into something else entirely. Again, like the art forms I've talked about prior, ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕦 did not just disappear. Bans and censorship on their own aren't usually enough to change much. However, remember, this was also a period of cultural change. As Nagayama writes, following the defeat of the Empire of Japan in the Second World War, macho values began to crumble, with the weakening of the pre-war and wartime regime as if it was already historically inevitable. Fragility began to proliferate. Before anyone knew it, fancy goods, represented by Sanrio's Hello Kitty, had saturated the culture of women and children. The word cute, kawaii, swallowed up beautiful, appealing, great, and excellent, and all of this started to overflow from the domain of women and children.
I remember watching a documentary on sake in Japan, and there is a large shift going on with the younger generation, especially with like those, I don't know if there's a special word for people who make sake, but like the classic sake brands, the ones that have been around for hundreds of years, like thousands of years or whatever, that they've always found a market. And there is a big cultural shift now with a lot of younger people where they've talked about, and at least what I've seen is that a lot of younger people enjoy flavored drinks over hard drinks, like straight up. Like they like the things that were flavored with fruits or that were really sweet. And I don't know why that just reminds me of that whole concept where he's talking about things going from being like the whole macho, like, yeah, I'm a big badass, my man, or whatever, to, and things like they said from beautiful to cute, softer, things that aren't as like in your face. It's just reminded me of that.
Following the baby boomer generation came the interstitial generation, or apathetic generation. They had witnessed their seniors' brilliant turn from protest fighters to corporate warriors and subsequent decline. Members of this generation were thoroughly fed up with machismo. Finally, when we reached the otaku and new breed generation below them, machismo was a joke, material for parody. With the rise of cute manga-inspired aesthetics and
all the Sanrio shit
of masculine ideals, it's no surprise that a former artist for Calm magazine, one ℍ𝕖 Azuma, would start to make his own doujinshi with a rather unique appeal. Azuma would take the already polymorphously perverse characters of Tezuka and draw them in explicitly erotic situations, taking that already integrated sexual suggestiveness and putting it on full display, which hadn't really been done before. Though they did still carry the idea of sexuality as part of a larger image, and these works, like Little Red Riding Hood in the doujinshi magazine Cybele, would mix comedy with straightforward eroticism, with, of course, an obvious focus on cute.
That looks really cute.
As Patrick Galbraith writes, pornographic manga had been done in a more realistic style, but as cultural critic Takakuma Kentaro recalls, with Azuma, suddenly, Tezuka-style cute characters were having sex. Takakuma sees the emergence of such art as resistance to and parody of the previous generation. At first, only a minority saw these images as erotic, but soon there was a vocal fandom, much to the chagrin of many older fans. This marked the birth of a genre of pornographic manga that was stimulating despite being, or precisely for being, unrealistic. That genre of erotic manga was, of course, lolicon, a word which, funnily enough, in Japanese does not directly stem from the Vladimir Nabokov book, but rather Russell Trainor's The Lolita Complex, which was actually a psychology text about human sexuality that got a famous Japanese translation, which may seem very familiar to hentai's origins in German sexology. Lolicon, as an art form, fit into the larger grouping of shoujo and bishoujo, and found massive popularity in the circles around Comiket. One theorized reason for its success being the idea that because Tezuka-style cute characters are round and cartoonish and notably hairless, you can depict them having sex without really depicting any realistic genitals or pubic hair. Ironically, by labeling things which had obvious associations with maturity and realism as obscene, it would seem Article 175 itself promoted the proliferation of porn featuring young, hairless, unrealistic characters. Ozuma's ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟 would be published in 1979, coincidentally around the same time that Hayao Miyazaki's Castle of Cagliostro would be.
Oh, it's so good.
Based on Lupin III by Monkey Punch, who had also worked for Com Magazine.
I love Lupin.
Ozuma. And a movie which, as I've talked about before, emboldened the lolicon community to create works around the main female character, Clarice, because they just found her so cute. This actually had such a strong effect that Comiket in these years shifted from a 90% female attendance to closer to 50-50, with its newer surveys showing around 57% women. Though, perhaps most importantly, by 1982, a full-fledged lolicon magazine, titled Lemon People, would start publishing, and quickly
That art
followed
is very
massive
cute.
success. I like cute things. That is what the arrival of Lemon People specifically, and the rise of culture associated with women and children and reevaluation of fragility generally, announced. So-called otaku and members of the new breed were part of a generation when, from the time they were born, weekly manga magazines and television anime were just there, normally. For them, Sanrio characters and other cute consumables were everywhere. They were the first bunch to profess a love for cuteness without hesitation. To cut a long story short, these men and women came to have disposable income in the heady economy of the early 1980s. They were the children of the slogan, "Consumption is a virtue." It is not a coincidence that Mono Magazine, a men's shopping and lifestyle magazine, which stoked men's material desire, and Olive, a female fashion magazine, which stimulated women's cute style, were both established the same year as Lemon People in 1982. It is simply that the time had come. I mean, I couldn't put it better myself. The time of lolicon was upon us, and the Bishoujo boom I talked about was also the lolicon boom. Bolstered by Japan's consumerism under the bubble economy, and by a generation that grew up seeing cute Tezuka-style characters, this boom would directly lead to the culture we see in Japan around anime and manga today, especially around erotic material.
Did you see that
After
shot
all,
of
in
heaven?
1984, what is often considered the very first animated hentai, or more accurately, the first erotic original video animation, would come out, and it would be called Lolita Anime, a part of a series of OVAs based on works published in Lemon People, one that would push the doors wide open for animated pornography of all kinds to take over. Now, I don't want to end this video with that old cliche, and the rest is history. This is by no means the end of hentai history, nor is it anywhere near the beginning, but this is ultimately where this video is going to leave off, if only because I know I have another one planned that should hopefully pick back up from here. With the
excited for
1980s
that.
leading into the 90s, we see the rise of the OVA boom and Japan's self-published animation market. There's this massive explosion of erotic manga and a lot of pornography that is more recognizably modern. It's the beginning of an era that you can't really start talking about without talking about everything up till today. Or at least I can't, so I won't. But if there's anything in this video that I want to stress, it's that this history is incredibly fluid and interconnected, and I don't think there's anywhere you can really draw concrete lines. Any point in history or individual work that looks like it might be a turning point usually only appears that way from a distance. Zoom in between 2 points you thought were disconnected, and you'll almost always find something in between. It's in those connections, though, where I think history becomes interesting.
It's where all the
Not
cool
just
stuff's
how
at.
something evolved, but all the different ways the evolution looped back in on itself, all the different ways it branches out unexpectedly. This particular part of history, this origin of hentai, is actually the origin of erotic comics, but as I've discussed, can be considered the origin of hentai as a word. It can be considered the origin of Japan's current obscenity laws, the origin of its cultural relationship with sexual material. It's impossible to talk about one without talking about all of them because it's all the same thing. And there are so many
That's really
connections
cool to
from
think
this that
about.
I didn't even talk about, both because I would be here all day, but also because we haven't found some of them. I've been gathering information from and quoting a variety of sources throughout this video. Mark McClellan,
Whatever. It's Miku. Oh, wait, I recognize all of these. I do. Holy shit. Oh, I have problems, man. I'd actually like to read this. I'd be interested in reading these, actually. I love reading. Reading is one of my favorite activities in general, to be honest. I probably read more than I do watching stuff. Unless it's VTubers. VTubers I have on constantly. They're just there. They're my buddies. They're my friends. They're the ones that exist in my home with me. They're forever. It's fascinating.
ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕟𝕒, Patrick Galbraith, Kimi Ritsu, people who have dedicated time and energy into studying the parts of Japan's and manga's history that nobody seems to care about as much as they should. But unfortunately, these are limited sources. A couple people cannot document the entire history of something as complex as this. Even what I've included in this video is a small slice of a fraction of what they've talked about, and I'd imagine if you asked any of them, they'd say they were just scratching the surface.
I really like the search for things, where we always have the endpoint for stuff, but it's always the things we find on the journey that is the coolest thing. Like he said, everything is so intertwined, and you can't talk about one without talking about the other. And you're gonna find out that one thing came from this, or something came from a movement, instead of being like, oh yeah, I just want to see booba. It's like, nah, government, fuck you kind of thing instead. It's so cool. You can see that, and then you go back from there. It's like, oh, then you have these protests, you have these other things, you have the results of what it was like after the war, of rebuilding, and like people finding their individuality, of being alive still. So good. What a good video.
And that's if we can even ask them about these things at all. Mark McClelland, whose article in Intersections I based most of this video on, passed away in 2020. It's already unfortunate that this is such a niche topic carried by so few people with such little recognition, but to imagine that it might become more niche or be carried by even less people, it's hard to think about. But unfortunately, this is a taboo topic. It's not something people consider researching or studying or documenting because we devalue sexual material so much. We don't think of it as something worth looking at seriously. I laughed at it before, but a lot of this genuinely does engender feeling of shame and loathsomeness in people, to the point that we'd rather ban it altogether than dare to think that someone might want to document it, to think that it might be important. Here's a final fun fact. Erotic artwork in Japan saw the biggest periods of growth and evolution during periods of its most radical progressive thought, both during times where there was free and open exchanges of ideas and art without consequence, or especially when there was active opposition to censorial governments. Whether it's Gekiga or Edogoro Nansensu, or even Shunga and lolicon, we can see hentai through its literal usage as a term meaning abnormal sexuality, used to highlight and commentate on and learn about cultural taboos through sometimes disturbing imagery. You really cannot argue that this material wasn't used for self-pleasure of any kind, but I think arguing that it was only used for pleasure that is perverse or deviant and thus should be eliminated is exactly what these movements have been fighting against. And it's exactly why those that want it gone have worked so hard to try and separate this erotic material from any form of politics or commentary it might have. This is not the first video I've ended with the message that we should take erotic material more seriously and do more to document it, but it also definitely won't be the last. Because until something actually changes, what more can I say about this topic? How much more do I have to hammer the point home? All I can really do is hope that you learn something and spread that knowledge.
I learned a lot.
People learn the same. But even I am just one person, uploading videos to a platform that loves to censor them, to an online community.
I thought I knew a lot, but no, I was actually educated in this
sort of thing. After all, you saw the thumbnail or the title and thought it was interesting. You wanted to see what it's about. And some of you probably thought it was a joke. Some of you, I'm sure, might have seen someone post it online with a witty caption about how they didn't watch it. I get it, I understand, but if that's the way things are destined to be, then we will continue to know nothing about hentai.
Here we go.
That was such a good video. Holy crap. That's exactly what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be a serious study of the topic instead of it being me and be like, oh, haha, hentai, whatever. Good on him. That's fantastic. That must have taken a lot of work too. But no, it's like, I can agree to like, obviously to a certain extent, there are things where it's just, they exist because they should have the right to exist and not because somebody tells us what we can or can't enjoy in our lives. If it's something that's like, at least in my opinion, it's always been this. If there's something that exists, even if you disagree with it, you don't like it, you think it's gross or whatever, but it does not harm a real human being, It's not a depiction of a real human being, or it's not like meant to like incite you in any way to like do violence or whatever, hurt somebody. It's like whatever. Who gives a shit? It's fascinating that exists. That you like even back then there's a lot of fighting a system for the sake of it to just for us to have. Oh, what a good video. God damn it. I'm gonna subscribe to him. That was wonderful. I've not watched really any of his other videos. I've seen one other video, of course, through a VTuber, which was I think his Rule 34 video, like the history of Rule 34. Yeah. Give him a follow. His name is ℍ𝕖𝕟𝕥𝕒𝕚. And this was an incomplete history of hentai. Good stuff. Holy shit. Let me go to... Haha! Look at me now! Give me my little just chatting screen. I didn't have this before, but I have it now. Oh, it's so good. Holy crap. That was wonderful. I actually had a good amount of viewers today. Thank you all so much for joining me for that. It was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. Holy crap. That was great. Oh, I hope everybody's doing okay tonight. I didn't plan on going this long, but hey, it's almost 3 hours and I'm getting my hours in on Twitch, so that's good. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm gonna be logging off now and going to get something to eat, and I have to put more work into my other channel. But thank you. I hope you're all doing well. If you're interested in my content or seeing more from me, I do game things. I've been playing Zenless Zone Zero a lot. I'm a big weeb man. I'm also an audio engineer, so you're gonna hear me nerd out about audio stuff a lot. But this is the time of the stream. I always save it to the end. I don't really like shilling myself throughout the rest of it because that's meh to me. But if you're interested, I do have an 18 plus Discord. You should be able to find it through one of the links in my description. I know for a fact it's in my link tree. But if you're interested in joining, like I said, 18 plus people who are just a bunch of nerds who like to hang out and keep up all the little stuff that I do, then please join. We like having more people there. It can be a little quiet at times, but everybody there is very kind. It's very chill. If you're interested in the other stuff I do some voice acting on my main channel on YouTube. It also goes under Onii-chan, which if you find me, I think you should be able to find that in the description as well. I do a lot of male for female videos, mostly about degradation and abuse and yandere stuff. I also do not safe for work, so that's cool. But if you're interested in supporting my channel and helping me keep going, helping me have the resources needed to edit these videos and other things, or giving me some motivation, you can find my Ko-fi link. It's been spammed a dozen times in chat already. I apologize for that. I'll have to fix that timer. But yeah, anything helps. Anything that everything is going to pretty much go to all of my editing software, where I do put a lot of time into editing my videos, like audio and all that stuff, to make sure it's as quality as I can make it within reason. There's also a throne if you ever want to buy little treats. And people have bought me a bunch of figures off of there and some candies and whatnot. If you ever want something that you bought personally in my vicinity, it's always appreciated. Again, it's never expected. I'm not begging for it. I'm just saying it's there. But it's something I do love. I do love to get from people. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you all have a wonderful night. Goodbye, everybody. Wah.